Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I've faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Pioneer Mindset. Excited to dive into another guest episode. I'm really looking forward to talking to this guy here. And so he's got a pretty good, decent following on Facebook and social media, and he's really done well about just showing the real raw about everything that they're going through on their farm. And so I can really appreciate that. And so I think you're going to find a lot of value in today's conversation. And so without further ado, we're going to introduce Matt Griggs to the Pioneer Mindset podcast. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, Garrett. Glad to be here.
Well, I appreciate you joining me here today. And, as we record this, we are sitting at the end of January. First month of 2026 is already come and gone. And so you guys probably have some pretty interesting weather here lately, haven't you?
Yeah, pretty much the west and middle part of Tennessee has been shut down for over a week now. We had one of those historic storms that, of course, we're here in the South, we're not really equipped to handle, don't have the infrastructure and everything. And for us at our farm, we were actually pretty fortunate. We were right on the dividing line of ice and sleet. We got a lot more snow and sleet. We were in a high risk of getting ice, but it went just a little far south. But unfortunately, people, just a county or two south and east of us, they got absolutely hammered by ice. Over an inch of ice just brought down trees on the houses, power lines. Just the electrical grid was devastated. And then there's still a lot of people without power and been bitterly cold, at least for us. I know you northerners probably laugh at, 0 to 5 degrees, but, down here, our houses aren't insulated like yours. Our water lines are not 5 feet underground, and, we're just not set up to handle it. But you take power away from a lot of these people. A lot of people on electric heat pumps and stuff, and it's a pretty bad deal for some folks down here, unfortunately.
Yeah, that can be a challenge for sure, regardless of where you're at. But if you're not set up for it, it's going to wreak havoc, right? So glad that you guys were able to kind of manage through that pretty decent on your farm. And really, as we kind of dive into things, and I'm jumping ahead here, but, we're going to be talking about some challenging times in general, right? And so, when you add Mother Nature on top of it, that's a whole nother caveat, right? So I guess before we get into that, let's take a step back and Matt, kind of introduce you a little bit, where you're from, what you do, and then just kind of explain a little bit about your background.
Like I said, my name is Matt Griggs. I'm owner-operator of Griggs Farms, LLC, here in Humboldt, Tennessee. We're about 6-7 miles north of Jackson, right in the edge of Crockett County. I'm actually a fifth-generation farmer. My great-great-grandfather, Robert Buchanan Griggs, actually started this farm when he moved a old cotton gin from about 5 miles down the road up into this area. And for the bulk of our history, cotton ginning was our primary industry. We did raise some crops on the side. We had some cattle, some soybeans, some hay, and of course we grew some cotton too, but cotton ginning was our primary industry and, provided the livelihood for at least the first 3 generations of Griggses. And then when my dad graduated college in the early 70s, he came back to the farm and my granddad was running the cotton gin, and my dad greatly expanded the row crop side, and ultimately got us up to around 950 acres or so. And I know that doesn't sound like a bunch, but when he started out at like 200 acres, and remember, we're talking about the 80s and early 90s, 950 acres was a decent amount of acreage back then and provided a living. And of course, I was born in 79, grew up on the farm and knew I wanted to farm. My dad actively persuaded me to not farm because he knew I had the intelligence to be able to do whatever I wanted to in life. And, he'd survived the 80s and, he saw how hard it was to make a good living at farming. He knew I could make a lot more money elsewhere. But so all throughout high school, he actively persuaded me to do something other than farming. But ultimately, when I went to college, I majored in plant and soil science. He saw it was my passion. He respected that. And when I graduated college in '02, I came back, started working with my dad. At that point, we were transitioning from all cotton to really incorporating grain because cotton was not very profitable at that point. And how I really got my start is, we didn't have a combine at the time. So he said, in order for me to make some money, because, my salary was pitiful on the farm, he said, in order for me to make some extra money, if I would buy the combine, he would pay me to custom harvest his grain. He also helped me rent my first farm. So it kind of took off from there. And I bought an old 1660 combine in 2003, and we started raising grain. I had my own little farm, and then unfortunately, suddenly in planting season of 2005, he became ill, like all of a sudden. And ultimately, between the time that he got sick and then he ultimately passed away was a month later. So, I mean, it was quick. And I mean, we're right in the middle of the growing season. I'm 25 years old, and my sister was still in college, and she wanted to help out on the farm too, but she still had to finish her education. And I'd just gotten engaged to my wife Kelly, and my dad passed away. I had to take over the farm. I was the only one that was able to do it. Because we had to salvage the season. We were right in the middle of the season, so just kind of took off from there. And at the time, heck, I thought I got this. I knew everything there was to know about farming. I was good. Had my college degree and everything. But looking back, I didn't know squat. But we learned the hard way, a whole lot of lessons the first few years. And I mean, we're still learning hard lessons every single year. So it was only by the grace of God that we didn't go bankrupt. We didn't lose a business, and we were able to keep on going, because we experienced some pretty tough hardships in that time. Like 2007 was the worst drought our area had ever experienced in like over 60 years. We lost $100,000 that year. And at that time, I think we were up around 1,000 acres. So, I mean, that was a massive blow. And if we'd had 2 years in a row like that, we wouldn't be here. So, by the grace of God, he provided for us. He watched out over us, and we survived, and we're still flourishing.
Yeah, wow, that's great. And I appreciate you sharing that context, because it kind of helps the listeners, helps myself understand some of the things that you've been through, just kind of scratching the surface, really. I guess take me back to, if you don't mind, back to being, 25 or even, 27 in 2007, when you're going through those hardships, and you've lost some money, you recently lost your dad, and I can't imagine what that's like. I guess explain a little bit. What was that like for you to kind of take all that on your shoulders? And I guess the comment that I'll make on that is, I feel like when we're in our 20s, there's so much that we don't know. We think we know everything. And I think if we knew everything that we didn't know, or I guess if we knew how naive we were, we probably wouldn't do a lot of the things we did. And it kind of goes back to our drive and fire that we generally tend to have when we're young, right? And so, I mean, explain what that was like for you back in your mid 20s, taking all that onto the weight on your shoulders.
You're absolutely right. I didn't know, and not knowing was actually my saving grace, because if I knew everything that I knew now and that had happened, I don't know if I could mentally process it. But at that time, the only thing I knew was work. So as soon as we had the graveside ceremony, I came home, I changed my clothes, I came to work, and that's what I did every day. And there's a lot of things I didn't know. There's a lot of mistakes that I made. But if I'd had that added pressure of knowing everything I know now, mentally, I don't know if I could have handled it. Not knowing what was actually involved, the magnitude of what was ahead of me, not knowing that is probably what actually saved me.
Right. No, that's interesting, because, like I said, if you knew all the weight that was on your shoulders, it probably would have been pretty easy to succumb to that. You know what I mean? And so, and for you, I'm guessing, and I guess you speak to this, was it part of your grieving process to actually just get out and work, and just work, work, work? You know what I mean? That's just how we were kind of taught, trained, and conditioned, probably, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm not necessarily, an emotional person to begin with, but, just getting back to normal and working, doing what I knew, like I said, all I knew was work. Ever since I was born, I'd been on the farm, working. It was therapeutic to get back to something familiar, something to do what I knew how to do. And I also got to say, if it hadn't been for Kelly, we weren't married at that point. We were a few months away from becoming engaged, but, she was a rock and having that support there. And, she wasn't working on the farm at that time. She had her own job in town, but, me being, a single person on the farm, obviously, I couldn't get every job done myself. And if I hadn't had there to say, go get a tractor when I got stuck and pull me out, or come pick me up at the field when I had a breakdown or stuff like that. Honestly, I don't know how I would have survived.
Absolutely. And it's probably a lot easier to look back on that now and be so much thankful. We're never 100% appreciative in the moment, but, looking back, we're like, right, wow, how would have we done that without, her or somebody else, right? So that's awesome.
It's just really funny. I mean, I have faith. I'm a Christian. I'm a believer in God and Jesus, and I know a lot of people out there aren't. But you look back on how certain events happened, how everything lined up in a row to see how, the Lord provided for me. Hardly anything happens the way I want it to happen. But ultimately, when I'm through it and I look back and see how just all the little pieces just fit together to get me through whatever it was I was going through, it blows my mind and it just reinforces the faith that I have.
Absolutely. And I can't agree with that more. Really nothing to add to that. But, as you talk about 2007, being what, probably 27 at the time, if my math is right, something like that, to where you have this loss comes on the farm. And I guess I'm just kind of curious, how did that shape your perspective moving forward, having, a really rough year and having to go through that?
The drought of 2007 was one of two events that really opened my eyes to we need to change the way that we're farming because I knew I couldn't survive another year like that. Just give you a little backstory. Our soils here in West Tennessee are some of the most highly erodible soils in the entire U.S. And from 1882, when our farm started, up until 1995, we were 100% cotton and, very intensive tillage. That's what we knew. And then in the mid 90s, my dad started experimenting with some minimum till, but we were still plowing. And eventually, there in the late 90s, he converted quite a few acres to no till. And we actually did our last tillage pass in 2002, the year I graduated school. So we were no till there for, 5 years before the drought. And, we saw things improve. But the drought of 2007 really opened my eyes up that, while no-till is a lot better than conventional tillage in our area, it's really only a Band-Aid. It's keeping the soil from eroding more. It might be increasing, pore space a little bit to, store more water and stuff, but it's really not rehabilitating our soil because it was so severely degraded. And 2007 opened my eyes up that, hey, just no-till going forward was not going to be sustainable. It was not going to get my land to where I needed it to be to lower my risk in future years because I knew 2007 was not going to be the last drought we were going to have. And the next time we had a drought, I wanted our soil to be a lot more prepared to handle it. And that was one of the major things that led us to completely changing the way we farm, to regenerative ag, soil health, focusing more on building the soil up than on actually growing crops. And then, I said that was one of two events. The second event, which happened a couple years later, was we started having Roundup resistant Palmer amaranth or pigweed. They popped up. We were a hot spot for that. We lost Roundup quickly. I think we lost reflex formation quickly. And I just saw that, the writing was on the wall. We've only got so many different active ingredients that will control pigweed. We're losing them at an alarming rate. I need to find different ways to control pigweeds because, just relying on chemicals going forward was not going to be sustainable. And we sure as heck couldn't go back to tillage. We'd been down that road. So it was those two things that really led us to start practicing soil health, jumped in with both feet on cover crops, using manure for fertilizer. And it's just been a progression since then.
Yeah, sure. So, basically, and that brings me to my good point there as far as like, we have to go through those hard times. I'm sure, like I said, 2007, losing $100,000, being young, be like, well, how are we going to make this back? And truthfully told, I mean, we can kind of speak to that on my history as well as, when I was young, probably mid 20s, we went through some hardships as well. But if we don't go through those at that time, it probably wouldn't have changed much in your operation. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, and that's the problem with a lot of mindsets of farmers. Most farmers are, older and, they've got a long history to look back on and, they've settled on what works for them. And when you find out what works for you, there's a popular saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so a lot of farmers, they get comfortable with what they're doing. It's been working for them. And then they kind of quit looking on how they can be better. How can they improve the system that they're already using? And, right now, I'm 46 years old. For the last 20 years, I mean, I've been gung ho trying to improve our operation. And finally, we found out what works. And it's something I'm actually having to fight in myself. I'm like, I kind of got this figured out. We've got a nice system and I'm comfortable in it. And I really have to keep trying to push myself each and every year to look at our operation and figure out what we can do even better than what we did the last year. What's the next step that I can make to make us more sustainable, to lower our risk and so on? Because, I've gotten to that age where I'm comfortable. I've gotten in my routine and I don't really want to break that routine. But if I'm going to get better, if I'm going to lower my risk going forward, I need to keep examining our operation and figuring out better ways to evolve.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think that's why people draw to you when it comes to social media is because you're willing to evolve. I know it's comfortable, right? To stay where you are, to stay doing the things that you've done. Would you say having that mentality of just always trying to evolve has one kept you in business, but two, gotten you to where you are today?
I would say so. I'm not scared of taking risks. I'm not scared of trying new things. It's just, before I make a major change, try to find all the pitfalls to where, because a lot of things, can sound good on paper, but in reality, it can be quite a bit different. And, cover crops is one of those things that, it sounds great on paper, but in reality, when you're dealing with weather and all the different variables, it can be a huge headache. And, the first several years that we, started planting grain and heck, even now, I mean, we're still learning new things every year, but there's a lot of problems that have to be figured out. But, I've kind of gone into it with a mindset that for every problem, there's a solution. I've just got to find it. There's a lot of times like I've been out in the field and I have a breakdown and I've only got like an hour left in the day. I can't go get parts. What do I have on hand to just get me by? And it's just having that mindset in the crop production side to there's a solution out there. I just have to find it. I believe in the system. I believe in the ultimate goals, but I've just got to find a way to work around this one problem. And that kind of mentality has really suited us well.
And I bet you'd be surprised how creative one can get, when you have that mentality of like, what can we do to just get by, or what can we do to fix this or actually solve the problem versus, not being able to solve it, or you know what I mean? Like there's so much creativity that comes from that, probably lots of new ideas, lots of new thinking, lots of new processes that come from just that mentality of, well, we're just going to go and figure it out and we'll just see what we can do to get by, right?
Yeah, definitely. One of the big problems we had when we started planting grain, planting corn and soybeans into green cover crop wasn't any problem. And then that first year that I planted cotton green into cover crop, I mean, we were planting several weeks later. The biomass was tremendous. I had cover crop over the top of my tractor, and I was thinking, well, I've got a Kinsey planter. I think I could plant in the pavement if I had to. It's a dang good planter. Like I'm not going to have any problems planting cotton, and then we pulled into the first cotton field and, like I said, cover crop up over the hood of the tractor. And I went 30 feet and everything on my planter locked up solid. I mean, locked up solid. Just a few extra weeks of growing had made a big difference. Anyway, we really struggled getting our cotton planted that year. I wound up driving to Carroll, Ohio, Brandt's farm to actually buy a roller crimper. Left out at like noon that day, got back at 8 o'clock the next morning and was in the field by 9 o'clock crimping cover crop. But we learned a lot that first year. And then for the second year, I was like, I got to find a better way to do what we're doing. And I actually designed a modification to our row cleaners because that was a big problem. Our row cleaners were wrapping up, but I really needed the row cleaners to move the cover crop out of the way because cotton is such a shallow planted crop. We're trying to plant it about a half to three quarters of an inch deep. And anyway, I took some old disc openers in our scrap iron pile, used a plasma torch to cut down the diameter, drilled some holes in them, and actually mounted them onto the front side of my curved row cleaner wheels to make, a solid row cleaner that couldn't wrap up. And we used that for 4 or 5 years until I bought my new planter that I put Martin Razor wheels on. But, it's things like that that was allowed us to keep doing the system, but eliminated one of the big problems I was having.
Yeah, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So, I mean, that's awesome. And so I guess, as we talk about the cover crop side and the soil health side, and I dive into that pretty deep too. We got a pretty good passion on that in our farm too. And so, as you progressed, because kind of take us to where you are today, and even I guess go back to where you mentioned that you had problems with, some of the resistance to Roundup and some of those different weeds. And so by utilizing the cover crops, because I'm just curious even for myself, what changed by implementing some of these different systems from just even the weed side of things?
I mean, everything changed. It didn't change overnight. When somebody's wanting to, start experimenting with cover crops or potentially planting green and, they want to figure out what their payback is because, cover crops aren't necessarily cheap to plant. You want to pay off as quickly as possible. I tell them if you do it right in year one, the first benefit you'll get is weed control. I mean, you can cut out herbicide applications, cut back on herbicide rates and everything else because cover crops is perhaps my best herbicide that I put out. It's the best residual I put out because if you grow enough biomass, you lay it down flat on the ground, you block the sunlight from hitting the ground, most of your weeds can't germinate. Palmer amaranth does not have very many weaknesses. But one of the weaknesses that it does have is it's got a super tiny seed, and if sunlight doesn't hit the ground, it's not going to germinate. So, year one, you can get weed control. And then I'd say by year three of continuous use, you start seeing a lot of benefits in your soil structure. You get heavy rains, they're starting to infiltrate into the ground more. That top layer is not staying muddy as long. You're getting water infiltrating down through the soil and your water holding capacity goes up. And then, starting, years 4, 5, 6, if you got enough biomass, your organic matter is going up. Each percent of organic matter that you raise in your soil can store about an extra inch of water. You get into August and you've gone 3 weeks without rain. How far will an extra inch of water get you? I mean, that could be the difference in making or breaking your crop. And then not only that, I mean, you're increasing the biology of the soil, your mineralization, your recycling of nutrients, you're making your phosphorus and your other nutrients more available to the plants. You've got living roots in the ground year round that's constantly extracting nutrients from the soil, bringing it up into the plant. And then when they die, they return it to the soil. There's been a lot of talks that, hey, our soils have got all the phosphorus and potassium we'll ever need. It's just not accessible. But if you've got plants growing year round, I mean, their job is to access those nutrients. They're releasing acids through the roots that are releasing those nutrients from the bonds. And if you got that happening 12 months out of the year versus, 3.5 or 4 months out of the year that you're growing a cash crop, I mean, you're increasing your fertility and, but all this stuff takes time. I set myself a goal when I started, like, I want to see real results in 10 years. And we've seen great results in 10 years. I'm not where I want to be yet, but everything that we've done has shown me that it's working and it's taking me to where I want to be. And, I don't know if I'll have the soils where I want them by the time I retire or die or whatever. It took a couple hundred years to really degrade our soils. I'm not going to get my soils built back in 20, 30 years. It's going to be a lifelong process, but everything we do is going to build upon the previous year and, eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. At least you're shooting in the right direction, right? And so I think, just thinking out loud, some of the naysayers when it comes to cover crops, and I'm not trying to dive into the weeds here, but it just some thoughts coming up is people might say, well, you're further east, maybe you get more rainfall. But as we both know, you've had droughts. And from the sounds of it, this last year was probably a pretty nasty one for you guys. So talk me through what that's like to still continue to use cover crops. Have you adjusted your plans? What's it like in the dry times? Because that's usually always the hang up as well. Cover crops use moisture, can't do that and all this other stuff, so just kind of enlighten me a little bit on that.
I've heard those same arguments and I'm not going to pretend that I've got the answers because I know how to farm in my climate. I don't know how to farm out in western Nebraska when it's a lot drier. I don't know. I do know that there's people that successfully utilize cover crops. They don't necessarily do it the way that I do it, but I know the principles are still there on building your soil up, but you're dealing with a limitation that I don't necessarily have. I think there's been 1 year in my career where I was concerned by how dry it was in the spring. That's our wet season. We're trying to get rid of moisture. Cover crops is fantastic at getting rid of excess moisture. We can get in the fields and plant a day or two earlier than what my neighbors can just because the cover crops have removed all the moisture. So I can't necessarily tell somebody, Colorado, Kansas, Western Nebraska that, has limited rainfall. I can't tell them how to utilize cover crops to benefit them because, if you don't have enough moisture in the ground to get the seed of your cash crop germinated, you're not going to make any money, and it don't matter how good your cover crop looks. So I do know the principles work. I just can't necessarily guide somebody on telling them how to make it work for themselves because I just don't have any practical experience.
Right. Context is everything. That's one of the six principles, right? Context, right? But then even kind of on your own farm, sounds like it's been a journey, and you're starting to see some of those benefits. On a year that it was dry, how do you feel like it would have been different if you hadn't adopted some of these practices? If you didn't have all the history that you have so far, have built up your soils and be to the point where we are. And obviously we're not to where we want to be. There's always shooting for higher goals, right? Higher sights on something else. But like if you hadn't been to where you are today, how would you have weathered some of the hard times, whether it be financially or even just the weather here lately?
Well, you mentioned this year, and we went 84 days without a rain beginning July 1st. Our cotton and our soybeans, that depend on rain in August and September to make yield was absolutely devastated. But I tell you what I saw in 2007 when we had the first awful drought, and it was along about the same time frame. It was a late drought, a late summer drought. Your July and August drought. 2007 was very similar to this year, but we did catch some rains later in the year in 2007. I think we went like 45 days without rain then, and it absolutely destroyed my crop. I made less than a bale an acre cotton. I made 110 bushel corn. I think our full season beans were probably around 10 bushels an acre. So, it was just absolutely awful. This year, we went 84 days without a rain, late season. And while we didn't make great yields, my plants didn't visibly show the stress as much as what I had seen in past years. They were still trying. Ultimately, they flat ran out of water. You don't have any water. You're not going to produce anything. But I couldn't believe how good the crops looked in the midst of that drought. And, this year, we made with almost twice of a long a drought as what we had in 2007, we made 742 pound cotton versus 480 pound cotton that we made in 2007. Our full season beans were 42 bushels an acre versus 10 bushels an acre in 2007. Our corn was 157 bushels per acre versus, 110 bushels an acre. Now, some of that increase is just due to different varieties, genetics, and everything else. I'm not going to say it's all due to soil health, but it showed me that, if we still been doing no-till this year, my crops just plain would have just died in the field. Because our main limiting factor is the depth of our topsoil. Like I said, most of our ground is extremely highly eroded, and we have a fragipan. And a lot of people get fragipans confused with hard pans and plow pans and compaction and all that kind of stuff. A fragipan was actually formed during the last ice age. It's a chemical bond between aluminum and maybe calcium. I can't remember the exact chemical composition, but it basically turns the subsoil into concrete. The vast majority of roots out there cannot penetrate it. Water has a extremely hard time penetrating it. And on a lot of our hill ground, which that's primarily what I farm, in a lot of places, we've got 4 to 6 inches of topsoil on top of that fragipan. So my roots can access 4 to 6 inches of soil that has moisture. That's why we are so prone to drought. And now one of the things we're doing is we're utilizing annual ryegrass to get rid of that fragipan because a doctor at the University of Kentucky has proven that the roots from annual ryegrass can actually penetrate that fragipan, and they release a substance through the roots that actually breaks that chemical bond, and it turns that fragipan into what you would consider subsoil, actually soil that can be productive and your roots can produce. So that's, while I've done great things to the 4 to 6 inches of topsoil that we got, I'm still trying to get rid of that fragipan to where we have greater rooting depth. So we've got multiple goals, but once I address getting rid of that fragipan, and so far we've dissolved about 9 to 10 inches of it. It's anywhere from 20 to 30 inches thick, and we're getting close to halfway through the fragipan of having it dissolved.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. No, good to hear. No, I guess I appreciate you sharing all that on the soil health side. I know I didn't necessarily intend to dive into that, but it's something that I think a lot of people can find value in. So, all right, folks, that's going to be all for this week's episode with Matt Griggs. Stay tuned for next week as we dive into the second part of this valuable episode. So that's all we have for this week's episode, and we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @GarrettRuskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.